On a Wednesday morning in January 1993, Gabriel Aquino Gonzalez, a 69-year-old beekeeper, and his father-in-law, Jose Sala, were preparing to inspect their beehives on Jose's property in a small Spanish town called La Romana. There were about 2,500 people living in this town, which was surrounded by farmland with almond and grapevine orchards. Gabriel and Jose kept their beehives in the mountains, in the middle of nowhere, near an empty house. They didn't check on the hives very often during the winter because it's not a good idea to open them when it's cold outside. On this day, though, they thought it was a good time for a check. At this point, Jose lit up a cigarette, and Gabriel went for a walk around the La Rambla, a deep gorge in the area. Gabriel was about to go back after 20 minutes when he saw something that caught his eye, the image of a watch on the ground, partly hidden by some dry bushes. It was strange that the trees looked like they were put there on purpose to hide something. Jose walked over and used a spatula to remove some leaves. Gabriel and Jose found something very scary. A big silver watch that was still on a wrist was buried under the trees. In the end, this shocking discovery shocked the whole of Spain and changed the lives of the families of three young girls, Miriam Garcia Iborra, Antonia Toñi, Gomez Rodriguez, and Maria Deseada Desire Hernandez Folch, for good. These three friends lived in Alcacer, a small town in Valenciana that is close to the eastern coast of Spain and has just over 10,000 people. Miriam, Desire, and Toñi were all 14 years old. Toñi was slightly older than the other two by 1 year. Toñi was one of 3 children. She had a sister and a brother. She was regarded as shy but kind and responsible. She always let her family and friends know where she was and if she was going to be late. Toñi quit going to school in 1992 and wanted to get a job to make some cash. Desiree was the younger of 2 sisters. She liked to have fun and often came out on top in competitive sports. Desiree was friendly and good with people, but she wasn't very good at school, so she had to retake the 8th grade in 1992. Miriam was very pretty, and she had 2 younger boys. She was quiet, shy, and sensitive. Miriam went to the La Florida Institute in the nearby town of Catarroja in 1992. The 3 teens also spent time with Esther Diaz Martinez, a 14-year-old friend. On November 12, 1992, Toñi called a nearby radio station and asked them to play Peter Schilling's song Major Tom for their group. The happy Toñi said on the call that she didn't have any specific plans for the weekend, but that she wasn't going to stay home. Toñi, Miriam, and Desiree were all at Esther's house the next day, November 13th. They were going to a nearby town called Picassent to check out a club called Coulor. The 2 places were only a few kilometers apart, so Miriam asked her dad if he could drive them, which is something he often did. This time, though, her dad was sick when he got home from work and couldn't take them. Esther got sick too and had to stay home too. These 3 girls didn't want to change their plans, so they left Esther's house around 8 p.m. Afterward, Esther said that the girls told her they were going to the bar but weren't going to go inside because they didn't have any money. They were just going to hang out outside at the door instead. Toñi, Miriam, and Desiree didn't have a ride to Coulor, so they chose to hitchhike. At that time, a lot of young people hitched rides to get to the club, even though it had buses for its customers. Francisco Hervas, 20, and Marie Luce, 19, picked up Miriam, Toñi, and Desiree at the last traffic light in Alcacer. The girls did not go all the way to their goal though, because Francisco's car had a fuel tank leak. The 3 were left at the Marie Picassent gas station, which is only a few blocks from the club. Many people thought this was strange because the club was so close, and Francisco didn't even say anything about taking the car to a shop after leaving the girls in his first statement. As it turned out, Francisco did not drop Toñi, Miriam, and Desiree off at the bar. They had to walk the rest of the way. No one knows for sure what happened next. Maria Dolores Barral Soria, 63, is said to have seen the girls get into a white 4-door car that was already full of 4 people from her window. If those girls were really Miriam, Toñi, and Desiree, that was the last time anyone saw them living. The families of the girls began to worry around 10 o'clock that night. It was time for dinner, but the girls still weren't home. After some time, Miriam, Desiree, and Toñi's parents called each other to let them know that none of their daughters had come back. Fernando Garcia, Miriam's dad, finally went out to look for the girls who had gone missing. He went to Coulor, but no one there had seen the 3 of them. On his way back, Fernando went to the civil guard post to say that Miriam was not there. He was told that it was probably just teens staying out too late though, and that he couldn't make a report until 24 hours had passed. At 9:40 a.m. on November 14th, 1992, after a terrible night, Fernando and the mothers of Toñi and Desiree went to the civil guard post in Picassent to say that their girls were missing. It was now the officials' turn to worry. Miriam, Toñi, and Desiree left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and no money, so it's not likely that they ran away on their own. The search for the girls began right away, with the civil guard first looking into the girls' friends and regulars at the bar. It was clear right away that the teens had not shown up at the place that night. Criminals in the area and people who had just gotten out of jail were questioned, but nothing was found. People all over Valencia were given thousands of missing persons flyers, and when the news got out, hundreds of people said they had seen the girls. The Spanish Interior Minister set up a task group called UCO to make the investigation go more quickly. Its headquarters are in Valencia, which is close by. Eventually, the investigation went beyond Spain's borders, and Interpol was told about it, even though it wasn't likely that the friends had left the country. Even though many groups were looking for the teens, there was still no sign of them. It was like they had disappeared into thin air. Fernando Garcia was heartbroken and felt guilty that he didn't drive Miriam and her friends to the club that night. He looked for his daughter non-stop and went on radio and TV shows to keep their story in the public eye. Not long after Esther went missing, Fernando went on TV with her. Luckily, Esther had stayed home that night. He went to London to talk to reporters and get the word out about the search. The deaths of his daughter and her friends were finally found while he was in the UK. On January 27, 1993, 150 kilometers from Picassent, farmer Gabriel Aquino Gonzalez and his father-in-law Jose Sala found their shallow grave, ending a 75-day search. At first, the police thought the watch and arm bone belonged to a guy, but then they realized they had found the teens who had gone missing. But bad handling of the evidence at the scene led to trouble later on. The bodies were half buried together in a pit. They were in different stages of decomposition and were covered with a greenish blanket. All three had been raped and abused before they died. One had its head cut off and its hands tied. A t-shirt that was too big, a torn jacket, a scribbled note, pieces of wood, rope, bone fragments, and a video game cartridge were among the things that were found. The police did not properly record the crime scene or gather proof from it. A lot of things were left behind, and the proof that was gathered was handled badly, so it can't be used for any more tests. Some important proof was a leaflet from a nearby hospital that had the name Enrique Angles Martins on it. This made the police quickly search Enrique's home, but they found that the paper belonged to his violent brother Antonio, who had been pretending to be Enrique. They came to the apartment with Antonio's brothers and Miguel Ricard, who is 23 years old. Even though Miguel was known to be involved in crime, he did not run away when he saw the police. They took him to question him. It was in Catarroja that Miguel Ricard Tarrega was born in 1969. His father, an abusive drinker, put him in an orphanage after his mother died young. Miguel's behavior got worse even though he had a scholarship because of problems at home and drug abuse at a young age. At age 16, Miguel quit school to help support his father, who was out of work, and started going to clubs and using drugs. He then joined the army and he was there for 18 months. When he got back home, his way of life caused him to break up with his girlfriend and kid. After that, Miguel lived with Antonio Ingles, a friend who sold drugs to him. Antonio was born in Brazil in 1966 and went to Spain when he was 2 years old. Antonio stole from his family to pay for his drug habit. In the early 1990s, he went to and from jail. Miguel and Antonio committed some small crimes when they moved in with the Ingles family. When asked about the killings of the Alcázar girls, Miguel said he was in jail when they went missing in December 1992. He talked about his white Opel Corsa, which looked a lot like the car the girls were seen getting into. Antonio didn't have a license when Miguel lent him the car. He said he hadn't seen Antonio lately, but the police didn't believe him because they had been friends and lived together for 10 years. Miguel said Antonio was mean because he had mental health problems, but he claimed that his brother Enrique was not guilty. The police didn't believe Miguel when he said he was in jail when the girls went missing. Calls showed that this wasn't true, and Miguel couldn't give a good excuse, so he was arrested around 5 a.m. on January 28th and charged with helping to kill Miriam, Tony, and Desiree. Autopsies on the victims showed frightening things like bound arms, signs of rape, missing body parts like heads and nipples, and gunshot and stab wounds. Tony's hymen was still whole. As soon as it was proven that the bodies were those of the missing girls, the media swarmed Alcácer and La Romana, asking the sad families for quotes on how they felt. After the terrible details of Miriam's, Tony's, and Desiree's deaths were made public, people were ready to condemn the first suspect presented, Miguel Ricard. The case against him was circumstantial. He knew someone whose name was on evidence found near the bodies, and his car fit a witness description. Around midnight on January 28th, Miguel admitted to taking the hitchhiking girls with his friend Antonio Angles in a blue seat Ronda, not his white Opel. He claimed the girls went willingly, had sexual interactions with the guys that night, but then he heard gunshots gunshots and found them dead. They reportedly wrapped the bodies in a rug from a nearby house before burying them. Miguel, however, repeatedly changed his story and later claimed that the civil guard had tortured him into making his initial confession. Regardless, police focused solely on finding Antonio Angles, who had a violent past of crimes like beating a woman for stealing heroin. With the spotlight on Antonio, other leads may have been overlooked in getting a quick conviction against the two men. When the civil guard finally found the woman Antonio Angles had beaten and chained for 25 hours, he had already been convicted but had escaped from a 6-day jail leave in 1992. His whereabouts were unknown, even after Miguel's statement. On January 29th, a second autopsy was requested by the families as the first was poorly performed, destroying much evidence like washing the bodies clean. The second autopsy found 15 pubic hairs on the victims, which could prove important proof. Miguel then changed his confession, giving more details like picking up the girls around 8 p.m. in Picassent, Antonio hitting one with a gun to break her teeth, and taking them to rape and torture. He also admitted using his white Opel Corsa, but on March 29th, Miguel again changed his story, retracting his murder involvement totally. The investigation faced numerous setbacks, lost evidence, changed testimonies, and the disappearance of the key accused, Antonio Angles, leaving the case floundering for solid leads. Miguel's story kept changing. He first claimed they were shopping and robbing banks the night the girls vanished. Then he admitted to being at the crime scene, picking up the hitchhiking girls with Antonio, offering to take them to the nightclub, but instead driving them to an abandoned hut in La Romana. There, Miguel stated they tied up and sexually abused the girls before Antonio shot them the next day and buried their bodies. However, Miguel presented himself as just following Antonio's lead out of fear, and his stories continued to change until his trial finally began in May 1997, after many delays. It was one of Spain's biggest trials, lasting almost 3 months. Miguel's defense claimed a lack of physical evidence tying them to the scene beyond the hospital pamphlet, with Enrique Angles's name. The hair evidence was also problematic. 12 hairs didn't match Miguel or Antonio, instead belonging to possibly 5-7 other individuals. With no DNA linking them and changing narratives, a major question remained unanswered. What was the reason behind such a gruesome crime? Miguel Ricard was sentenced to 170 years in jail on September 5th, 1997 for the kidnapping, rape and murder of the 3 girls. Antonio Angles was considered the main culprit, but had been missing since March 1992. He was briefly noticed in areas around Valencia looking unkempt before an alleged Lisbon, Portugal sighting in March 1993. The disturbing case left many unanswered questions about motivation and opportunity. With Antonio still at large and evidence mishandled, the Alcázar killings became one of Spain's most notorious and unresolved crimes for years to come. Antonio Angles' story became shrouded in myth and theory. How could one man disappear so thoroughly when the entire country was looking for him? A skull found off the coast of Ireland briefly raised hopes of finally finding Antonio, as it had a deviated septum like his. However, DNA tests against his mother's sample ruled it out. Some, like Miriam's father, Fernando Garcia, doubted the official story of Miguel and Antonio as the sole culprits. Fernando believed that his own investigation suggested that high society members may have killed the girls for a snuff film, though he lacked proof. He faced legal consequences for openly alleging a pedophile conspiracy within Spanish politics on TV shows. Shockingly, Miguel Ricard was released in November 2013 after just 20 years, due to Spain revoking policies that previously allowed keeping violent offenders imprisoned longer than the EU's 30-year maximum term. For Miguel, this would have meant a life term in prison. However, in 2013, a Basque separatist prisoner successfully appealed her extremely long term to the European Court of Human Rights. This led to the revocation of the Parrot Doctrine, forcing the Spanish state to pay compensation and follow the European Court's decisions in other criminal cases. As a result, Miguel was released after serving only 20 years of his 170-year sentence. Miguel did a short interview after he got out of jail and said he was innocent and had been set up. After that, he tried to start a new life, but it was hard because everyone in Spain knew about his story. Miguel was last seen in Madrid in 2021 when he was being checked by cops. The murders of the Alcázar girls are thought to be over, even though there were problems with the investigation, such as DNA proof that wasn't very strong and one of the main suspects going missing. But there are still a lot of questions about what happened to Miriam, Tony and Desiree, and people are still waiting for the whole truth to come out. Follow us on social media or look at the links in the video description if you want to learn more. Also, if you liked the movie, please think about leaving a comment and subscribing.